their future is more properly with their elected government and not under the influence of the Taliban. But thirdly, it's for the people. It's not just for the people of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we could talk about that, but it's also for the people of this country as well. I mean, there are those out there who would challenge our way of life. They're challenging it in Afghanistan, they're challenging it in Pakistan, and the links back here are very clear.
General Dannett. Well, let's speak to Trevor Moss, the Asia-Pacific editor for Jane's Defence Weekly Asia. He joins us from central London now. Some terrible figures in terms of British troops and casualties as well. What about those civilian casualties in Afghanistan? Because when General Stanley McChrystal came in, one of his hopes was to avoid the use of airstrikes, wasn't it? And all the collateral damage that had previously caused so many problems politically and winning hearts and minds on the ground.
That's correct, but there's only so much that General McChrystal can do to control civilian casualties caused by the Taliban. I think the vast majority of civilian casualties are caused by Taliban bombs. NATO has reduced the number of people who've been killed by airstrikes, but unfortunately the Taliban continue to use reckless tactics, and the civilians bear the brunt of that, unfortunately.
Does the Taliban understand that? Because recently, in the last few days, I've been reading that the Taliban has issued a sort of code of conduct to its commanders, saying to try and target foreign troops and diplomats and to try and avoid civilian casualties. Does that mean they're losing hearts and minds on the ground?
Well, I think that's probably not the case everywhere. I mean, the Taliban has a very good PR machine, and unfortunately for the NATO mission, a civilian who is killed, whether it's killed by the Taliban or by NATO fire, that is a minus mark against the NATO mission. NATO's job is to improve security for ordinary people, and if ordinary people are being killed, however they're being killed, then that's bad for NATO, unfortunately.
When we see British troops, foreign NATO troops, of course, on the ground, we know that there's been this recent surge to try and make these elections run as smoothly as possible in a few days' time. But fair to say that these elections won't be free and fair and as democratic as we would understand elections to be in the West.
Well, that's obviously going to be the case. I mean, you have to accept a certain level of democracy at this stage. They've never had a democracy like ours in Afghanistan. And we have to be modest in our expectations. If the majority of the population can take part, then I think we could look at that as a real success.
Well, how modest is free and fair?
Well, I think you have to get all the different ethnic groups of the country participating. And that's going to be a big challenge in the south, in the Pashtun areas, where the Taliban have a lot of influence. If you can get a reasonable proportion of all those ethnic minorities taking part, then I think we can be pleased with the outcome.
Abdullah, of course, the main rival to President Karzai, says there is no way that President Karzai can win this unless he rigs the vote in the first round.
Well, I think that's very debatable. I don't think anyone really knows what's going to happen. President Karzai is a Pashtun himself. He has a lot of Pashtun support, if he can mobilise that support. But that's a big challenge because the Taliban have been winning the war of intimidation. In the south, a lot of Pashtuns in particular are scared to go and vote. Will those people turn out? We just don't know yet. We'll have to see how it goes in a few days.
What do you read into his decision to sign into law this Shia family law thing as well? I mean, is that just a blatantly cynical attempt to try and win a swing vote there?
Well, I think he is obviously doing what he can to garner extra votes. I think the challenge of Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani have probably taken him by surprise. A lot of people saying the election could be closer than people originally thought. So, yes, I think he's trying to mobilise as much support as he can in the remaining days.
And just a final thought. Over the weekend, Bob Ainsworth was touring the television studios and talking about the 200 British servicemen to be killed there. He said today that the conflict was winnable. How should we define winnable? What sort of measure?
Well, it's going to be a much more modest measure than what you would have been talking about a few years ago. Back then we were talking about Afghanistan being a beacon of democracy in that part of the world. Now I think we're just talking about a sort of functional, self-sustaining country that can curb extremism, and it's not going to be fully democratic, at least in the near future. It's not going to be self-supporting financially, but it could support itself in security terms. And I think that's where we have to get Afghanistan in the next 3 to 5 years.
OK, Trevor Moss from Jane's Defence Weekly. Thanks for speaking to us.
Well, staying on that subject, 8 years ago when the US-led coalition ousted the Taliban, one of the goals was to improve human rights and the lives of women.